Evening, everyone. Hello. Now, I'm going to go. I'll go through a few of the little questions first as well. But as I usually try to start on a particular topic, just so that we don't bounce around lots of topics from the start. That way, anyone watching it afterwards, not live, isn't just watching some random covering topics at like a minute a time. But although I'd sort of prepared something, I looked at some comments early on and thinking, well, maybe we could switch it to something else. So I'll cover a couple of these sort of completely not related questions, but I'll just pose it to people because someone's in fact someone's actually well. Should we talk about dishonesty in politics? Whose fault it is, why it exists. We could have a little philosophical discussion, on dishonesty in politics, looking at not just the Tories but Labour's position as well. Because as I keep trying to talk about, when you look at other things, it's fine. When you look at Brexit, there's a big disconnect between what Labour are saying and what they're doing. Not that they're going to go back on their word, but that there is a. If you listen to what they say about Brexit, you would imagine that the long-term trajectory for a Labour government is one way, but when you look at their policies, it's completely another. So we could discuss, why there needs to be this dishonesty, or we could discuss something else. So I'll wait for the comments in there, but I'll pick on a few others. So Patricia started off by saying, still seeing a lot of negative comments on the left of the Labour Party about Starmer. You wouldn't expect those to go down because when we talk about some of the ones on the left, I always have to emphasise it's some of the ones on the left, what you might call the hard left. Those people, before he was even made leader, were attacking him. Obviously, now that we have this disconnect between policy and statements, or statements now and statements 2 years ago, if anything, there's more reason. So I don't think it's a case of why are we still seeing negative comments, because you could look at the polls. You could look at the polls and say, well, Labour are doing quite well, shouldn't that silence the doubters? But there's doubters and there's doubters. There's doubters and there's people who are so firmly entrenched in their views they will never change no matter what. We see it with Brexit all the time, don't we? I'm doing a video. You back Brexit into a corner and they have to suggest something completely mad to justify it. But there were a couple of ones. It says, M saying, not remotely political, but could the pipe and bubbles make a reappearance at some point, please? See, I have to bring that out. It went for emergencies. It loses its power if it's used too frequently, I think. So that's like pulling out the stops when anyway. All right, this is easy from Brad. Do I think that next week we'll see a large wave of Tory MPs announcing they're standing down? I strongly suspect so, yes. The reason for this, so obviously there's been several Tory MPs who've already said they're not standing next election. It's not a surprise, the timing of it. Conservative Party headquarters has actually contacted all Tory MPs to say, can you tell us in the next couple of weeks if you're definitely not standing? Because obviously they need to start working on candidates. It's always assumed that a sitting MP will be the candidate for the next election. They don't work it in quite the same way as Labour do, but even then, from a practical point of view, if someone is the sitting MP, unless they face like disciplinary action, it is expected that if they want to be, they will be the candidate. So what the Tories are doing is saying, look, we're trying to get ready for the election. We'd like to know. The fact that they've asked for that information now does mean that although I am quite sure that they are wanting the election in 2024, or I'm fairly sure, there is a suggestion that they have to be ready should there be one next year. But anyway, John, you're falling foul of the YouTube algorithm. I will just have to check it. Right, okay, that one seems fine. I suppose that one's fine as well. Right, my mic is visible. Oh, it's shocking. I mean, yes. Shall I make it more visible? It sort of needs to be there. I mean, I can't move it too much further to the left, there's the problem, because this is where I have my computer now, just to the left of the microphone. It used to be that I used to have my computer on the right when I was in the conservatory, but anyway, right. Well, okay. Well, let's as people are going to start talking about this anyway, let us discuss then the nature of honesty in politics. So let us get rid of this. I think it's this. There we go. Honesty in politics. So, I mean, I've read, the reason why it's quite interesting as well, I think it might be of general interest because I've seen quite a lot of other commentators commenting on it. You know, so the way I look at it in politics, I've said before, when it comes to honesty in politics, there's political honesty, which is different to honesty that you and I would talk about. You and I, if we talk about honesty, someone says what they mean. What sort of mic is it? I don't know. I can't remember. And it's a Rode mic of some kind, but I can't. The thing's on the back. But yeah, so you know, if in normal terms, if you describe someone as honest, they're someone who tells the truth to the best of their knowledge, someone who does what they will say, someone whose word is their bond, type of thing. We understand that sometimes they may tell white lies to save someone's feelings, but it's never malicious. Whereas in politics, you know, I consider political honesty, you set out a policy and you fully intend to enact that policy. You know, if for some reason you do not enact that policy in the way that you indicated you would, I want there to be a provable, unexpected event that occurred that prevented you. But the reality is that in politics, like, people will say, oh, they want honest politicians, but they don't vote for honest politicians. They fall for lies. And the reason is because what the prospective parties need to try and say to people is, we can make your lives a lot better, but there won't be any downsides. People don't like the downsides, because instantly what happens is party A says, we're going to bring you these upsides, but it's going to come with these downsides as well. Party B says, we're going to bring you these upsides, there will be no downsides. And I use those terms because that is exactly what people are told about Brexit, but it's what people are told in politics in general. And it's who do people vote for? The party that says, we're going to do this, but it is going to mean this trade-off? Or do you vote for the party that says, we're going to do this and there's no trade-off, it's just all clear skies? And we can see that time after time, people will vote for the grand promises every single time. So really, a politician that is not honest, a politician that is honest in the terms that we would normally want them to be, will not win elections. No one will win elections. The best you can hope for a political leader is a scenario whereby the truth is aligned with what their voters want. So there are some issues where you can. So Labour, for example, don't have to lie on economic matters as such, other than where Brexit policy is concerned. They don't have to lie about the need for strong public services, because they intend to do, and it's in line with public opinion, and they intend to do that. Where they do, in fact, really, although I'm not saying everything is totally on the level, but really it is Brexit where is the issue. And in fact, I'll put what Alan's just said about the union, so we'll cover this as well. I think Starmer's stance on unions is kind of worrying. I thought it'd be all over Sunak's jibe of him not being tougher. I think he should be more supportive. Starmer has been incredibly supportive. Starmer has been a lot more supportive of the unions than some, and I'm going to say some of the unions have been of him. But I will point this out. So there are unions that are affiliated with Labour, and there are unions that are not affiliated with Labour. The only union not affiliated with Labour that has been critical is Unite. And at the same time, what I would say about them is they are actually having to hold investigations into corruption from their former leader. So maybe they should like focus on their own affairs. But you say, so you look at, in terms of Starmer's support for the unions, in what way is he not supporting the unions? He's telling his MPs not to go on the picket line. What good does MPs go on the picket line do? None at all. If you ask a union leader, what good does it do? None at all. It doesn't do any good. At all. It's not, they can't even claim, oh, but it'll help get public opinion on our side. It's like, no, it won't. And public opinion's largely on their side anyway. So all it does is make a Conservative government more likely, because there is, you think to yourself, so what's the reason Starmer won't let his MPs go on the picket line, or at least advises them not to? And the reason is because Labour want to be in government. And if you're in government, when there's a dispute, you have to facilitate that dispute, not be on one side or the other. Even though some people will think one side is in the right, that's always the case in any dispute, someone will think one side is in the right or the other. But the government have to be the ones that bring them together. So the government have to be neutral on it. But the fact of the matter is that Starmer is clearly, I mean, when people try and suggest that Starmer has certain characteristics or politics or something like that, that's completely at odds with his decades of public service before he ever became an MP. Remember, he only became an MP in 2015. Before then, he was a lawyer. And as a lawyer, remember, he supported unions. He even gave legal help to people who couldn't afford it. If you couldn't afford it, during the strikes of the 80s, for example, he gave them his legal help anyway, if they couldn't afford it. And it's like, people are trying to suggest that suddenly, after a man that's, getting on, let's be honest, it'd be, if it was in any other job, he'd be heading towards retirement. I mean, he's not there yet, but, he'd be getting there. He's certainly been in the workforce for decades. That all of a sudden in 2 years it's all of his values have flipped. It's like, no, it's ridiculous. He's playing a strategic game. It's really that, and again, people will say things like, people will say that I don't know what Starmer stands for. Where does he stand on this? I don't know where he stands on that. And I think they're asking the wrong question. It doesn't matter where Starmer stands on it. People are making the assumption that a party will have the characteristics of their leader, that where the party leader stands, that's where the party stands. But that's not the right way to think about it. In fact, you shouldn't want that to be the case. Why would you want that to be the case? Why would you want the leader to impose their own politics and personality on their party? They should be generally aligned, otherwise what they're doing in that party, let alone being elected its leader. But beyond that, the leader should actually be there to help the party gain power, which means he has to align the party with the voters, not himself. Again, a political, and I think I said to someone earlier today in a comment that there may be genuinely exceptional, very, very persuasive political leaders every now and then. Not even once a generation in any particular country, but maybe around, if you think about around the world, every now and then you get a truly exceptional politician who can actually lead. And when I say lead, I mean they can impose their vision on others and they can get those people to follow them. I don't mean in an autocratic sense. I mean, actually get people to follow a vision. But political leaders mostly can't do that. The ones who try lose. They lose the election. Because the voters say, no, this is our vision. This is the vision we want. Is this they'll say to each political leader, is this your vision? If that political leader says, no, it's a crap vision, it might be true. But the voters will go, well, I'll not vote for you then. So over there, wouldn't a pro-Labour MP going to a picket line be a favourable PR for that MP if they were publicly pro-Labour, not the whole party, but these particular MPs? No. As far as voters are concerned, they want the situation resolving. Now, if you look at polls, I mean, then these are not updated as frequently as the ones upset. So the last polls I can see on YouGov regarding strike action tends to be from like summer So we don't know what the absolute up-to-date situation is. But what you can, I'm looking at them now, what you can see is, by and large, the majority of the public are supportive of a lot of workers going on strike. Now, ironically, where it tends to flip is where they're frontline emergency service workers. So that'll be interesting when it comes to nurses and firefighters, for example. But generally speaking, in fact, the last thing, so it says, let's go for the rail workers. This is drivers. I can't find one for rail workers specifically. But for train and underground drivers, and that's a different union, but train and underground drivers, should they be allowed to go on strike? 55% say yes, 34% say no. And you find that for lots of professions, as long as it's not an emergency services profession. There it's a bit more nuanced. But generally speaking, the public back it, but not all of the public do. And even the public that back it, they still want the strike over. They don't think to themselves, oh, my train's been cancelled, brilliant. Unless, of course, the train was needed to get themselves to a crap conference for work that they didn't want to go to. But generally speaking, people don't think, oh, good, my travel plans have been disrupted. Or, whatever they're going to be deprived of as a result of it, or I have to find childcare for my kid because the school's closed, whatever it is. They don't want the strike. No one wants the strike, but they are supportive of it because they understand the need for it. But the way you end a strike is with agreement, and the government need to find that agreement. The government are not going to get agreement by telling one side they're in the wrong and they should back down. That doesn't work. As James O'Brien said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Yeah, lots of people do that. What I will say is, when it comes to an election, if you don't want the worst form of government, you vote for the better option. Because if you don't vote for the better option, if you say, I want the one I want, all of it or nothing at all, you will get the nothing at all. That is the. However, I will also say that when it's not a general election campaign, or when there's not an election campaign of any kind going, there is nothing wrong with arguing your case. You don't have to look, for example, at Labour's current policies and say, okay, well, it's this or the Tories, I'll back this one. You don't have to do that. You can say, well, it's still not good enough, so I will try and persuade. But the problem is, if you're trying to persuade the politicians, you're barking up the wrong tree. Because there's two types of politicians. There's the ones who will take a line that their target voters will favour, and there's the ones who will lose elections. So if you try and barrack Labour politicians to change their policies, and you're trying to argue it from the point of view of your idea for a policy is better, then either they will ignore you or they will lose the election, in which case you still don't get it. So what people really need to do, and it's harder, is you have to persuade people. Because if the public opinion, and I don't mean the overall public opinion, I mean target voters. If target voters' attitudes change, the parties will change. They'll follow them. This is why Brexit will die. Brexit is not sustainable. Because the attitude amongst target voters for both Labour and the Conservatives will change. And it won't even just change as we suffer more and more damage from Brexit, although that inevitably helps. Again, I talked about this earlier in the week. It's just the passage of time will. Brexit is still right now supported largely by elderly voters. Elderly voters who, of course, vote in record numbers. Now, if one of two things changes, if either other demographics have started voting in much larger numbers, that will change it. But there's no evidence that's going to happen. So then the second thing is, as those elderly voters pass on, and middle-aged voters become the old crotchety voters, big voting bloc, then without a change of attitude amongst any individual people, the attitude of the target voters has changed, and the politicians will follow suit or lose. That's their choice. That's why, by all means, try and persuade and try and argue. And if you want to do that with a politician, fine. But ultimately, The politicians are just trying to follow whatever line gets them elected. Would I not want leaders making arguments to persuade people of the merits of a position? One of the big problems with Brexit was no leader really championed membership of the EU. That is correct, yes. And that would be lovely in theory. But here again is your problem. So if you're a political leader and you set out to persuade your target voters effectively that they're wrong. Now, I know you wouldn't go out and just tell them, look, you're wrong, this is the right. But, you know, so you try and persuade them. You some campaign to persuade them. Okay, fine. Here's where I have an issue when it comes to Labour. So if you're trying to persuade those target voters that Brexit's a bad idea and we should reverse it with all haste, okay, you are up against the Conservatives, who are the party of government right now and therefore have much wider access to the public. You're up against the mainstream media, who are also largely backing it. Even the parts that aren't really backing it are still not they're only just starting really to even tell people what's going on. The BBC, literally in the last couple of weeks, has started properly reporting on Brexit. And it's very late in the day. You know, so that you'd be up against the mainstream media. And you'd certainly be up against the parts of the mainstream media that are privately owned by the people who drove Brexit in the first place. You would be up against all the external influencers via social media as well. You'd be up against all that. So what you'd be saying is, you'd be wanting the Labour leader, whoever it is, don't matter who it is, you'd be wanting the Labour leader to somehow persuade voters that the Conservatives are lying. You may persuade them of that. The mainstream media are all lying. All their research on the internet is all lies, and only Labour are telling the truth, with maybe some Lib Dems. That's what you're trying to persuade people of. Now, I'm going to say, if any Labour leader had those powers of persuasion, they would not be in opposition. So again, there's people seem to think that if Labour say a thing, the public will believe it. If Labour saying a thing could get the public to believe them, they would be in government. They would not be in the party of government is the one that was best at persuading people that they should be in government. But anyway, right, hold on. Why am I fully foul of the algorithm? I've no idea. In all honesty, I've no idea. I don't even know how it works anymore. Like on Twitter these days, for the past month or so, you know, if I put the word idiot in a tweet, I don't even have to be directing it at a particular person. I don't actually respond to people and call them idiots. I'm actually quite polite on Twitter. But if I even use the term idiot on Twitter, it says, are you sure about this? It seems a bit aggressive, or words to that effect. So I don't know. It's just one of those things. It's quite funny because, you know, maybe it was the word racist or something like that that came in and it's like, oh, divisive. But social media likes divisive. You know, it gets views. Weird. Anyway, can I see Starmer implementing policies to improve the media, by which I mean introducing methods to ensure the media is held to account more, blah, blah. Yes. In fact, I think it's Labour policy to implement Leveson properly. And in fact, I think it would be not unlikely to have in fact, is there even an inquiry for another, policy for another inquiry? I definitely think it is. I seem to think it is Labour's current policy to implement the Leveson recommendations in full, which goes back to the old phone hacking scandals. But it's not, and bear in mind, Keir Starmer was personally involved in investigating some of those as Director of Public Prosecution, so he certainly knows about that. Even though I have just literally said a few minutes ago that just because he has particular views doesn't mean that he will impose them on his party or the government. But yeah, I definitely think there would be some reforms. How far, I don't know. Because again, if you look at it, there's every aspect of government at the moment is on fire, isn't it? So if you think a new government forms, whenever it is, next year, the year after, a new government comes in, and you think, and you'll think, oh, they should do this, and they should do this, and they should do this, and they should, and there'll be a million things they should do. But they've only got time for so many. You know, each government department, you know, can be working on multiple policies, but can only really drive one major piece of legislation at a time because it takes a lot of focus. But I, as I say, I am pretty sure that it is Labour policy to implement Levinson. Surely Starmer should look into regulating press ownership. Can't be right that organisations ultimately owned outside the UK have such influence over the lives of millions of British citizens. Should, as in it would be the morally correct thing to do, would it be politically the correct thing to do strategically? Taking on the media is tricky. It could be argued that you are far better off doing, you need to keep the public on board with it, I think. Now, and they will fight tooth and nail, the media. They'll fight tooth and nail against the Levinson recommendations, but they will come and the public will be on board with that because they were always on board with that. And in fact, the fact that there's been some more recent phone hacking allegations made as well may keep it in the public eye for a bit. But in terms of banning foreign ownership of the media, I would very much support it. I don't, if they kick up, well, they will kick up a fuss, let's be honest, they will kick up a fuss. Would Labour get away with it? Would the media, who actually shape, this is the thing I said to someone in a reply. Really, if you're thinking about who leads public opinion on a lot of things, it's generally the media. The media are very persuasive. It's not politicians. Politicians don't persuade the public of anything, it's the media. And so taking them on, it could be argued that that'll be a big old, that could be a tall order. So I don't know. I don't know to what extent they will. Certainly what I'll be quite sure about is that there will not be any stated policies for something like that unless we're right at the election. There's certain things where even if it becomes Labour policy, you would be mad to announce it too early. Like, for example, proportional representation. And I'm not saying that as if I think they will go for proportional representation and they're just being quiet at the moment. It's just because I really don't know. It's just that if they were intending to reform the way Westminster elections work for the House of Commons, you would not announce it until the manifesto was being launched. Starmer could become PM without any editorial press backing, according to David Yelland. Well, at the moment, you would hope so. But again, it's a case of not... oh, there's a naughty word there, but it's not too bad. It's a case of... I've forgotten the train of thought now, yeah. Not taking things for granted. Like at the moment, no matter where you look, you cannot see Labour losing the next election. But Labour, I keep saying it's a little bit like being a sports fan, like a football fan, say. Your team's 5-0 up at half time. So you come back to the second half, put your feet up, you're just enjoying it, your team's going to win, romp it home. Even if they don't score another goal, easy win. But the players on the pitch can't think that, the ones who are 5-0 up. Because if they behave like that, they could actually still lose. So it's all right for the observers who are not directly involved, you just enjoy yourself. So the same thing will be true of Labour. I think unless they drop the ball, and they do drop the odd ball. I think for example, and someone brought up earlier, this rhetoric on immigration, which they have to be careful of. Again, it's another one like Brexit where it's a little bit out of kilter with policies. If you look at their policies are fine. I don't think anyone has an issue with that. It's sometimes the little rhetoric, and I think it is an attempt to dog whistle xenophobes. And I think on the one hand, I will not thank Labour for taking a principled stance that loses them the election. On the other hand, words matter, and I don't believe that they had to take the stance they did last week in order to win over votes. I don't think they had to do that. So I do think Labour probably made a mistake there, but we will see. But anyway, sorry, I've lost my train of thought completely. Media is too broad. I mean newspapers. I don't just mean newspapers, no. because now we have the BBC, which is not reporting things properly. We have GB News and Talk TV, which are not even attempting to, and they are attempting to grow. And who's going to bet against them being able to grow and turn into a sort of, I know Fox News, GB News wanted to become like Fox News, but it can still happen if they're allowed to the freedom to do so. So I don't just mean newspapers, I do mean online media, television, news outlets as well. Just because the newspapers seem to be the worst doesn't mean to say you allow some other outlet to become the worst. It's also not particularly difficult to get around foreign ownership prohibitions. They'll just run it informally. Well, certainly if you brought something like that in, you would have to make sure it was very tight, the legislation. You know, you say it's easy to get around. It depends. If a government wants to bring some rule in, but it doesn't really, then what do? They leave loopholes. Like you can look at, for example, tax arrangements. So I've just filled in, for example, my tax returns. And there's a question in it which says, have you used any tax avoidance schemes? Now obviously I haven't. I don't have enough to be worth my while anyway, but and you can answer it's perfectly legal. It's not tax evasion. Tax evasion is lying on the tax return. So tax avoidance is perfectly legal, but the only reason these schemes exist is they're not just, oh, it's the sort of thing that, it's because politicians will try and say that they're going to, clamp down on very wealthy people not paying their fair share of tax, but then leave massive loopholes in them to do just that. And the same thing can happen in all sorts of legislation. If the government enacts legislation just to appear popular, just to be popular with the public, to make it look to the public like they're doing something, they just leave a massive loophole in. Like, if you take standards, for example. So when we come to things like, which has again been in the news today, pollution levels in our waters, water companies just pumping tons and tons of effluents into our rivers, seas, whatever, just our waterways. And obviously they fired back blaming ministers. And you look at something like that and the government will say, but we've got these really high standards. We haven't lowered our standards. These are really high standards. But it's like, yeah, but you removed a lot of the monitoring. So it's all right saying that in theory, the law says that water standards, we've got certain levels of water standards. But if you're not monitoring the water quality very much, then you don't notice when the standard drops and therefore there's no enforcement. If I give you an educational example, so when I was a teacher, a few years ago now, but I mean many years ago when I taught a lot of GCSE. So I started teaching in the late 90s and there was a very interesting time over then, because what would happen is every year the GCSE results would come out, they were better, and everyone would go, oh, GCSEs are getting easier. And I sort of told them, because I'd followed it, for GCSE maths, I taught GCSE maths a lot as well as a bit of science. And what I would say to them is that the actual papers are not getting easier. But what was happening was the percentage needed to get particular grades was coming down. So the papers weren't easier. And this is where the journalists were getting it completely wrong as well. The papers weren't getting easier, but it was getting easier to get certain grades because the percentage needed to get them was coming down. And it's the same sort of thing when you're legislating. You can make it appear that your standards remain high, but you just leave ways to bypass it. But anyway. You think that TV news in the UK is a bit more tame due to regulators, but newspapers obviously more biased. Yes, they are more biased, but again, there's no point in allowing television news, which also doesn't do the job it should do. I mean, the reason why a free press is an important cornerstone of democracy is it's supposed to be the freedom to speak truth to power. It's not supposed to be the freedom to speak lies to the public. Can't control social media, so maybe media control TV and papers is off. Yes, you can. Oh, you can control social media. In fact, what was the first thing that pretty much happened when Elon Musk took over Twitter? Someone from the EU Commission tweeted, You'll still be following our rules. You know, and then a load of gammons went, no, they won't, no, they won't. Yeah, they will. Otherwise, they won't be allowed to operate in the EU. It's really that simple. You know, this is why I keep saying, you know, when we had the issue over Cambridge Analytica, and Mark Zuckerberg had to appear before the EU Parliament to answer questions, and he did do. And then the British Parliament tried to pull him in to answer questions, and he did not do. So, you know, they know they can get away with thumbing their nose at our Parliament because our Parliament will take no action. But they also know that the EU Parliament will, and the EU Commission. It's like if the social media giants do not play ball, they will take action. And as a result of it, we've had major changes. If you look, for example, at YouTube's policies, take their algorithm, for example, in terms of these comments, and you know, being able to monetize and meeting certain conditions to be able to monetize it. And that is a direct result of the EU saying, no, you're going to actually make some serious efforts to make sure that you do not use your platform to misinform. Now, it's not going to be perfect, of course there's going to be misinformation anyway, but you can absolutely impose laws on social media to make sure that they make some decent efforts. Twitter were actually, think about it this way, before Musk took over, Twitter over the last year had been making quite a lot of progress. Well, obviously down the pan now. Hold on, what's this? Hold on. Have I missed something interesting? Maybe. I might have to go too far back to see it now. Your daughter was quoting news off of TikTok at me earlier. Well, again, this is why I keep coming back to why Labour must be absolutely mad not to be taking social media seriously. It's at the end of the day, Labour's opponents are using social media. I don't just mean the Conservatives. I think they are, but I don't think they're necessarily using it brilliant either. It doesn't matter. There's plenty of people with lots of money and lots of organisation that are using social media very effectively, and it will be used far more in the Conservatives' favour than Labour's. You know, that's the frustrating thing about being on the left wing of politics, actually, because no one's organised. People on the left wing of politics, they are driven by principle, very nice, very good, and no brains. No brains at all. No organisation. You know, whereas on the right, commercial interest makes it worthwhile. Some very wealthy people doing their bits to change public attitudes, public, mood. Whereas people on the left don't. They just shout at their echo chambers. And it's like, well, this doesn't work. There'll always be different rules for objective journalists and subjective journalists. Yes, but just because you can't completely solve an issue doesn't mean you give up. It's like medicine, isn't it? You can say we cannot completely cure everything, but we can still try. We can still make things better by trying. And the same thing there. I'd never be put off by the fact that, you know, you won't ever be able to get a perfect achievement. You say, when you were younger and a single drinker and smoker, I knew under Labour I would pay more taxes, but they paid for the NHS and education, so it was okay. Resent it now, paid for incompetence. Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing is as well, you generally don't pay more under, certainly if you compare the last Labour government with the current one for the roughly 13-year period. It was a 13-year period for Labour. It's at the moment 12 and a half years for the Tories, but it will be 13 quite soon. You pay less tax under Labour. So this idea that Labour will charge more tax, it's more the case that Labour have a higher threshold when it comes to the minimum level of public services. So that's what it's true to say that. It's true to say that Labour have a much higher threshold when it comes to what is the minimum, the standard of public services that they will accept. And that can mean more money. It doesn't have to mean more money though, because of course, if you don't waste as much on crooked contracts, then you can save quite a lot. I mean, look how much the government just pissed away in 2020 alone. I mean, that was a bumper year, granted, but I don't think they've actually spent 37 billion on the track and trace thing, but that was the budget for it, and I think it is now probably about 30 billion, and tens of billions on fraud, whether you PPE fraud or furlough fraud. And you just think, I mean, that alone would have wiped out this so-called black hole. And then when you haven't got the public services, you can't grow the economy. So with Labour, there was more public spending on public services, but you didn't pay as much tax because there was more tax being generated through higher economic growth. And this is why they haven't used the line for a while. I don't know why, but Labour were using the line for a while, accusing the Conservatives of being high tax and low growth. I don't know why they stopped doing that, because at the moment it's very prescient. But this is what you do. If you have low growth, you have to raise the rate of tax that everyone pays individually, because you won't be generating as much from profits, because you don't make as much profit. You conduct tax avoidance too. You avoid cigarette duty by not smoking. Okay, good. I do that as well in that case. Unfortunately, I think lots of people will be engaging, and this is again another problem. So with the government's attitude, so we're trying to argue for wage restraint, for example, because they think, oh, wages go, inflation goes up. Well, yeah, it does. Well, inflation's already really high. Yeah, it is. But the problem is that people then can't afford to spend as much. And it's even if you're talking about people who could still get by. I mean, the main worry has to be for people who cannot get by. They actually cannot afford. You know, they're sitting. I mean, I've got that room shouldn't be beyond. I've got 5 lights on in this room, just so that I can have a green screen. Probably don't strictly need. But there's some people who can't have lights on in their house. They cannot afford it, or they can't afford to cook anything. You know, I've had to cook something tonight because the pissing Indian didn't deliver the takeaway. Arseholes. And didn't bother to tell me either. But it's, you know, but even for people who can get by, they're going to spend less. So that means businesses are going to get less business. So those businesses will struggle. So your economy shrinks again, because people can't afford. The very people, ordinary workers, the very people who spend the vast majority of their income, they don't have much savings, they can't afford to save. So you give them more money, they spend more money. Grows the economy. But they don't, they're going to shrink the economy. So less money will be raised from taxes on profits. And so they'll have to raise the rate of tax again. It's not going to come down. From my experience as a teacher, do I think that when Labour get elected, they should take education back under local authority control? I don't know. Again, it's one of those things. There's nothing wrong with a certain level of central control. The problem is that it is then completely unable to meet local demands. The problem with local authority control, and I think on balance it is probably better under local authority control. The problem with local authority control is that when there's an issue with education, it's like the problem for the government, I completely understand it, is who gets the blame. You know, if councils generally don't get the blame, what local councils generally get the blame for are things like potholes and rubbish in the streets, things like that, the things that people sort of know is the council's job. The reason why it's very tempting for government ministers to centralise power is because they don't like being blamed for someone else's cock up. You know, it's why quite a lot of Tories don't like devolution, for example, because then they think it's unfair when they get blamed for something that the Scottish or the Welsh government might do, for example, might actually be responsible for. You know, the same thing with local councils. But on balance, it will be better because a local council is much more likely to at least be in tune with local needs. Whether they're any better is another matter, because I have to say my experience of local councillors is you have roughly half of them that are there for the right reasons and want to do a good job. Doesn't necessarily mean they're good or competent. And then the other half are just on the take, or just there on a power trip. Anyway, I feel that many people on the left only tend to see things in the short term. It's frustrating as hell as a leftist myself. It is. The level of organisation on the left is truly ridiculous. And it's like the public are always facing slick, very well organised, very well funded information or misinformation campaigns, or disinformation, depending on how you want to look at it, campaigns. And the public are always going to be faced with that, and they're never going to be faced with the counter view, because the counter view has to come from people who are just so angry that they just shout. Shouting at people doesn't change their mind. It just makes them think they don't want to ever listen to you again. Oh, and don't forget the wrong satellites. Yeah, I forgot about that briefly. Yeah, Dominic Cummings buying a bankrupt satellite making company that made the wrong satellites. I don't even know how much that cost in the end. It's a bit difficult to counter Labour as a high tax, low growth party with Labour saying Tories are high tax, low growth party, as it negates each other's argument without any evidence. Well, the evidence at the moment is that, as Rachel Reeves was pointing out last week, if you compare the growth from the last Labour government, the average growth per year, it is 50% higher than has been the case under the Tories. So there's your evidence. And in terms of taxation, again, no one's disputed that. The media are quite freely saying that we are paying the highest taxes in over 70 years. Well, that's way before the last Labour government. So inevitably, it's quite easy to say to the public that you are experiencing lower growth than under Labour and higher taxes. So it's actually at the moment in this, and that's why I say it's a bit mad that I haven't heard them saying it a lot at the moment, because I keep saying we're in recession. You're supposed to be in recession when you've had 2 quarters of negative growth, haven't you? And we're only in that. It's like it's certain we're going to be in technical recession next year. So we might as well behave as if we are actually now in recession, which we are. So therefore growth is negative. Growth was not negative under Labour. There was the financial crash where yes, it shrank, but then it started going back up again. And as for taxes, again, it's really easy. So no, at the moment, it's a very easy thing to get to stick to the Tories. It's like children at playground repeating what the others say, and very annoying, so I can see why Labour have dropped the mantra. But there is a point at which you don't want to let the opposition, or their opposition, which is the government, control the narrative there. And it is something that works, and it's something that's going to carry on working. To keep it going. Remember, the government's budget plan is to keep taxes and borrowing high until the election, and then expect whoever follows them, or them themselves, whoever forms the government after the next election, they are the ones who are expected to drop taxes and drop public spending. Well, drop borrowing at the very least and drop public spending. So it's one that Labour can use all the way to the next election, because it's the Tories' plan. I'm not saying they won't knock income tax down by a penny just to try and tempt a few people, but by and large the taxes are going to remain high and the borrowing remain high all the way to the next election. So I still think they should be using it a lot. Like a living wage, do we need government to impose a living price so farmers get paid properly and food security is maintained? Yeah, where I'm okay with the notion of where the private sector can maintain something, fine. But as far as I'm concerned, the priority, as far as the government's concerned, the priority is the country, people, society. And what they need to do is, where a corporation or a business, or large or small, needs to justify its worth to society. The problem we have is we have this attitude that they don't. And we need a government that says, look, you do. Now you can either do it voluntarily or we'll make you. So when it comes to certain industries, It needs to be a case of, look, you're not going to take the... I mean, at the moment with energy, for example, there's been massive profiteering. So what the government should have done is said, look, you're profiteering, so you're making all these extra profits. You've got one of two options: either don't, or we'll just take the extra profits as a windfall tax. Your choice. You know, you're going to end up with still very high profits, but you're not going to make excessive profits. And it's either you either drop your prices or we just take it in tax. Which do you want? But that, unfortunately, is not the attitude. But it should be. And I do think maybe, and again, I keep trying to say, I don't want to be one of these people that says, oh, Labour should do this and Labour should do that, because I keep reminding people I'm very data driven, a very data driven individual. And I am constantly minded of the fact that I do not get to see Labour's polling of their target voters. I only get to see general public opinion across the country. Sometimes it's broken down by regions. It's still, and sometimes I can break it down according to Labour or Conservative voter and things like that. But so sometimes I can drill down a bit, but not as much as Labour can. So I have to always be aware I do not get to see what Labour get to see in terms of attitudes that their target voters have. But I do think that Labour could make quite a lot out of saying that all businesses should ultimately justify their worth to society, because all businesses succeed in a society. They wouldn't, you know, if all of a sudden civilization crumbled, these businesses wouldn't do very much on a desert island or anything, would they? Or a you know, like post-apocalyptic wasteland. You know, there's no shareholders then, so they need to actually justify themselves to society. Make sure that while you're making your profit, you are of value to society. And if you are not, then the government will intervene. That is the job of government. Government's job is to intervene for the good of society. I think people from across the political spectrum only see things in the short term, transfixed by promises that would benefit themselves. There is an extent to which sometimes you have to as well, because a parliament is of a fixed length, even though we don't have fixed terms parliaments anymore, but it is of a fixed length, of a maximum length, we should say. And promising to do something where you won't see the benefits for 20 years is fatal. You know, it is a bit of a barrier to actually doing anything long term. Governments do still make long term decisions, but they are much more motivated for short-termism, because if you put something into place where you don't see the benefit for 20 years, some other bugger takes the credit. Someone else takes the credit. Like, for example, coming to the hospitals, these 40 new hospitals which haven't materialised. Stephen Barclay tried to claim credit for a hospital that has just been built, but it's not one of the 40. It was a hospital that was started, that Labour authorised the funding for and the plans for in 2009 when they were in government. The Conservatives just blocked it basically for years and then decided to eventually allow it to carry on again. So it's taken all this time basically to build it, 13 years to build it. And the government claimed credit for it because it was built on their watch. And that is the problem with politics. You can put things in place for the long-term benefit of society, but some other toe rag is going to take the credit for it, and you are landed with the cost because you're the one who has to budget it. So if a government right now was to say, right, we need this massive project, whatever it happens to be, and we're going to have to, you know, the funding for it, we're going to have a massive injection of funding now and then a bit more of funding every year. So the massive injection of cash, £100 billion, whatever. Hopefully not that high. So you get landed with the bill for it. You get accused by the people who don't like this project of the costs of it and how much it's costing the average taxpayer and all the rest of it. And then when it comes to fruition, the same people who are attacking you for it, if they're in power, they'll take credit for it. Quite happily take credit for it. But anyway, markets are immoral. It's the job of government to correct that. Yes, exactly. It is the job of government to regulate private enterprise. And that should be its complete focus. The government should be, if something's not working for the benefit of society. It should have its guiding principle. Is this to the benefit of society? Its guiding focus should be, you know, if the answer is no, how do we fix it? In the first instance, absolutely tell the industry that's at fault, this isn't good enough, fix it. Give them a reasonable amount of time to do so. If they won't, right, we'll legislate. Politicians need to pass some sort of certification for suitability to serve, like DBS checks or hair psychopathy checklist. The issue is with democracy, of course, is that it is supposed to be anyone can be elected to high office, which has to include arseholes and idiots. So, yeah, unfortunately, you cannot have any real I mean, you might have some barriers, I suppose, in terms of very serious criminal offences, but generally speaking, you can't really have barriers. Anything that would be attacked as elitism. Oh yeah, someone saying here, I guess the main problem I have with people on the left is they don't tend to be willing to make short-term compromises in policy if there are improvements in medium or long term. This is also true. Like, for example, when we talk about the hard left, strategically, what would make the hard left happiest? I would argue proportional representation. Because what happens if we have full party list proportional representation for House of Commons elections, Westminster elections? Instantly, the Conservatives and Labour are suddenly weakened. It will take time, but they are now weakened because they no longer need to be the broad church. The Conservative Party exists as the broad church of the right wing of politics because that is how you win power in first past the post. You can't win power by just focusing on a core minority. So it needs to be a very large minority. And Labour lose their status as the broad church of the left. What will happen eventually over time, what will happen is the Conservatives would probably be split into two. A very far right Reform UK type thing. In fact, maybe they'll just join Reform UK, who knows. And the more moderate Conservatives, who will still probably be to the right of the Lib Dems. There's no point in trying to be another Lib Dem party. And then the Labour will definitely split. There's no argument about that. You know, you will have the centre-left party and you will have the hard-left party. And they will win MPs. And they will at some point be able to get into coalitions. But it will also be good, I think, for people on the left, on the hard left. Because what they'll also learn is they can't get away with having obstinate, fairly useless leaders. Because that's another problem with being on the hard left. They elect people based on what they think their principles are, not their competence. There's no competency test for people on the hard left. Jeremy Corbyn wasn't competent in the slightest. Doesn't matter that they might have agreed with his policies or they thought he was a good man. He was fundamentally incompetent and he surrounded himself with incompetent people. So, you know, if they're plunged into a position where they can exist as their own party, they don't have to coexist with the centre-left. That they can exist in their own party and still achieve electoral success. But to form coalitions, they'll need to compromise with other parties. They can't just be obstinate. And obviously they'll know that their leverage in negotiations for a coalition will be enhanced if they can win more seats. And they will know that they will win more seats with better quality candidates. So it will be in their interest to get candidates who understand reality, who can face reality. Oh yes, I saw that, yes. You studied creative writing at uni. It was writing whole books just so you could give your teachers a synopsis. My organisation's dreadful. Well, there is and there isn't. Like some people who think they're disorganised are not necessarily, but when we talk about organisation of the left, I mean on a very large scale that one person can possibly do, where you need proper systems in place of understanding reality, reacting to real situations, not imagined situations. You know, there's too many on the extreme, both wings of politics, there's too many people who are, when they're faced with an issue, with a challenge to something that they think, instead of overcoming it, instead of facing it down, okay, how do we need to adapt to this? They just turn revisionist. They just change the way things work. You know, they make out that something isn't true, and the problem with that thinking as well is it steers you further and further away from reality. Because what happens is, if you anchor, everyone has to make assumptions in life. Everyone's view of reality is based on assumptions, and those assumptions may not be true, but you have to believe certain things are universal constants. And if you have anchored your universal truths on shaky ground, then inevitably what happens is you might read some reports from someone, some news organization, that goes against your view. It challenges your view. Well, you think they're lying, they're dishonest, so you stay away from them. And the problem is, if you do that with news organizations that are actually reporting the news, the real news, you are now cutting yourself off from real news, because in your mind it's not real news, they're lying. And you just end up going further and further down the rabbit hole. Whereas what we really need is people who are willing to accept the notion that if your beliefs are worth anything, they're worth challenging. You know, you don't have to hide away from challenge. But anyway. Plenty of successful Lib Dem alikes in countries with PR. Yeah, there would be. The Green Party and the Lib Dems will absolutely flourish under proportional representation. You know, like the thing is, first past the post only works for a two-party system. And even then, it's still not great. Because the fact, if you have a two-party system, that is a bit of a sign that your politics isn't working very well anyway. Because it's not nuanced enough for people. But it only works in a two-party system. Whenever you introduce others, it doesn't, because you end up with, you can end up with a situation where people end up electing the choice they least wanted. You know, so when we go to general elections, you've got people who support Labour, people who support the SNP, people who support Greens, Plaid, the Liberal Democrats. 5 progressive parties in Britain alone. We're not even talking about Northern Ireland. So 5 progressive parties in Britain who nick each other's votes, depending on where they are. The SNP don't nick very many votes from Plaid Cymru, of course. But, you know, you've got 5 progressive parties that to a certain extent are nicking each other's votes. And the Conservatives, which for most people is the worst choice of them, you get people to rank political parties by choice, and many of them will rank the Tories in last place, and yet they still end up with the Tories. So, mad system. So inevitably, with proportional representation, the Liberal Democrats, even if they didn't get any more votes, with just the normal votes they would get, they will get many more seats. But they will get more votes over time, because what will happen is pragmatic Lib Dem supporters will say, right, I can stop voting Labour now and I'll vote Lib Dem. Which of course will contract Labour and the Conservatives' votes because of that. So yeah, PR will completely shake up British politics. Why do the Tories claim the policy of people paying tax only above 1257 is their idea? When it was a Lib Dem policy before the Thingy Alliance. 1257 what? What's 1257? Or do you mean, have you shortened it? Do you mean the personal allowance? The personal allowance has been in for a very long time. That's not a Lib Dem policy either. It's just been in a very long time. But obviously, so if you're talking about policies that the Conservatives may claim as theirs during the coalition years, there is a sense in which it is fair enough, because the Conservatives had the vast majority of MPs and nothing got passed without their votes. And again, this is one of those things in politics of you can put a policy in place and some other bugger will take the credit for it. That's politics. So it doesn't matter whether it's a Lib Dem policy or not. You know, the Conservatives can claim it because they were in government. The Lib Dems can claim it as well if they want. You know, they can claim a 20% share of it according to the number of MPs they had, but at the same time, in fact, it won't even be that, would it? 15% share maybe. But anyway, right, we're sort of running out of time here. But again, this is just politics. There's no point in complaining about it. It's a political party's job to achieve power, as much power as possible. How do you do it? By persuading people that you are the party that should have that power. How do you do that? By persuading them that when they've had power, they've done good things. Now, you could argue that the only good things the Conservatives ever did were during those coalition years, massively outweighed by all the bad things that killed very many people. But the Conservatives want power, so of course they will claim credit for anything that was popular. Doesn't matter who originated the idea. But anyway, yeah, we'll have to call it there. Thank you very much for calling out, everyone. Have a good evening. We will be back on again next week when it will be December, and I've got a sneaking suspicion I will no longer be able to throw disapproving looks when my partner plays Christmas music, even though it'll be nowhere near Christmas still. Never mind. But anyway, yes, have a good evening. And until next time, I'll see you later.